All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are listening to this. This is Dual Credit U.S. History, and we are looking at Chapter 2 today on England's colonies. All right, so we are going to start here with Mr. Shaw and see what he has to say. Or not. Hold on, let's try that again.
Imagine what it was like if you were a Native American standing on the beach of North Carolina or Virginia or Massachusetts, and suddenly, out of nowhere, you saw a sailing ship on the horizon headed toward you. The Indians faced a very difficult choice. What were they going to do with these strangers from Europe? Some of them immediately tried to defend themselves and kill the Europeans. Others embraced them, offering gifts and helping them get started in their new settlements by explaining how to grow corn, for example, in the New World. Over time, of course, the Europeans brought infectious diseases that killed millions of the Native American peoples over the years. As a result, whether by force or by disease, the Native American population plummeted by the 18th century, and others were pushed westward beyond the frontier. As a result, North America became primarily a European civilization and unfortunately a dying Native American population.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the background of the English. So we'll start off with the characteristics of British development in the 1600s. So obviously, the United States is far from Great Britain. So since the settlers are kind of apart from the European continent, the British Isles are able to develop kind of in isolation from the rest of Europe. So by the time of the first British colonies, most of the feudal remnants of England were on the wane, meaning they don't really have the whole peasant society that they used to have, where it was all about the lords and the peasants growing the crops and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of on the wane. They don't really have that as much as they did. And it leads to a development of beliefs concerning what British citizens had the right to obtain. So really there's a big change in mindset and starting to get the belief that you can accomplish more and you don't have to be born a peasant, die a peasant. So one of these is the right of the English to certain liberties. They had forced on their monarchs limitations on the divine right of kings, and this is in the form of the Magna Carta. And it states that people had certain rights that not even a king could violate. And this is a precursor to our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution. So this is kind of a precursor to that. You also have English enterprise. So the growth of trade, it leads to the growth of the merchant class. It's usually composed of younger sons, because remember that the eldest son is the one inheriting the world. So those younger sons who are denied the inheritance of their family's estates are the ones who are really involved in this merchant class. The expansion is going to see the birth of government-supported monopolies in trade and the creation of corporations that are capable of developing and maintaining colonies in the New World. So the colonies have to be paid for in some fashion. So this is where merchants come in and people basically purchasing colonies. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little English background here as far as your kings are concerned and your leaders of England while settlements are being started. So Queen Elizabeth, she dies in 1603. She never married, she never had children, so she has no heir. So the throne falls to the Stuart family, and you get James VI of Scotland. So James VI is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And he inherits not only the English throne, but he's already ruling the Scottish throne. So this is where you get the unification of England and Scotland. And it's unified under James VI of Scotland and James I in England. So he's James in both countries, but he's the first in England and the sixth in Scotland. He rules from 1603 to 1625. And he does not really have... he wasn't really raised by his mother. He doesn't really have the same ideals that she had. And he's kind of insensitive to the will of the people. And he claims that he only answers to God. He does have a kid, his kid Charles. He succeeds his father on the throne, so 1625 to 1648. So Charles I comes in. He is not a whole lot better than his father. His actions are going to cause first Scotland and then England to erupt in civil war, ending in 1648 when he, Charles I, is beheaded for treason. During 1648 and 1660, they have had their king has been beheaded for treason. So they don't have a king at that point, but it is jointly ruled by the Lord Protector. His name is Oliver Cromwell, and Parliament. When Cromwell dies, the position falls to his son. He is very weak and does not rule effectively. So in 1660, Parliament chooses to request the return of the Stuart line. So they ask back the Stuart. Conscious of his position, the role Parliament played in the death of his father, Charles I. So Charles II is the son of Charles I, who has been beheaded for treason. His reign from 1660 to 1685 is relatively peaceful between the king and Parliament. Doesn't do a lot to kind of upset anybody. However, his brother James I. No, he's the second. I think my PowerPoint is wrong. I'll have to change that before I do this in class on Tuesday. Anyway, James II was not really circumspect. After assuming the throne in 1685, he's ousted in 1688 when he made clear that his newly born son, who was to be raised as a Catholic, would succeed him on the throne. So they don't really like him coming up and saying this is how it's going to be. They were trying to get away from that. So James II is out of there. And that's not the end of kings and queens, because they still have a queen today, so don't think that. But all right, so we've got that. This is a picture of the execution of Charles I. This is done by a Flemish artist named John Weesop. He witnesses the king's execution, and he paints this gruesome scene from his memory. He's so disgusted in quoting, a country where they cut their king's head, that he refused to visit England again. So you'll have to note, not the only country ever that cut off their king's head. Many years later, French Revolution and whatnot, they behead their king as well. So, not the first, not the last. All right, so we have the Glorious Revolution next. So in 1688, Parliament invites Mary Stuart and her husband William III, Prince of Orange, to joint rule on the throne. This was termed the Glorious Revolution, as Parliament succeeded in winning its freedom from the crown and established itself as an independent and equal institution. So these days, the Queen of England, she does not have a lot of power in ruling. She's more of a figurehead. And so this is kind of the start of that. It does not always go that way, which is why we're breaking away in 1776, but this is kind of a precursor to it. You have the British Bill of Rights in 1689, which improves on the Magna Carta's limitations of the powers of the monarchy. Perhaps most important for the British people and future American colonists was that there was no taxes allowed to be levied without the consent of Parliament. So they couldn't raise taxes without Parliament's approval. Parliament is starting to get more powerful. All right, so how do they come over to the New World? So part of it is these joint stock companies. So in 1606, James I establishes a joint stock company that allows members to buy shares of the company and receive a return on the profits. This allows the company to finance the venture while at the same time spreading the risk, so that if it should fail, it's not going to be that big of a disaster. So you've got several people in to buy into the company. So there are some differences between what the English do and what the Spanish do. So the English pretty much settle along the Atlantic seaboard, and if you've ever seen a map of the 13 colonies, that is quite obvious. They choose a place that's already sparse in Native American settlements, so they are not necessarily going in and taking over Native American lands to the same extent that the Spanish did, especially with their encomiendas. But they're looking for less populated areas. There's really nothing similar to the advanced civilizations that the Spanish subjugated in Central America, so it wasn't like an Aztec civilization that they were coming in and taking over, anything like that. Or the Incas, for instance. So they really have to start from scratch. They don't have a lot of help from the Native Americans, but they do have some that help guide them. So there are some instances where the Native Americans really help out the settlers. All right, so this is Old Virginia. This is a 1624 map of Virginia by John Smith, and this is showing Chief Powhatan in the upper left-hand corner. Up here. Left. All right. All right, so we have the Virginia colony. Oh, I'm sorry. Change the slide. The first one's going to be, it's going to be established in 1607 when settlers travel up the James River, which they named themselves after their king, King James I. And they settled inland to hide their colony from the sea. They named this settlement Jamestown, again, after their king. Virginia was expected to turn a profit for their investors. Majority of settlers arrived were more interested in discovering gold than planting, which leaves hard times in their first winter. So, they're going off that Spanish experience of finding gold, and that's what they think is going to happen. They're going to come to the Americas, and everybody's going to find gold and get rich. And so they don't really kind of make any plans to stay there for a long time. So that definitely causes some problems. The Indians of the area, they're led by Chief Powhatan. Okay, remember he is in charge of the Algonquin Indians. He establishes trade with Jamestown. He helps keeps the colonists alive for the first winter. They're also assisted by John Smith, who's going to rise in leadership among the colony, and eventually he's going to enact a policy that's going to dictate only those who worked would be provided food. So if you were kind of a lazy ass, then you could not eat. Jamestown is going to get more settlers in 1609, which includes women, which obviously, if you're going to propagate a society, you do need women. So over the next few years, a series of revisions are going to be made to the charter to make the colony more effective and help it grow. So it does eventually become a successful colony. In 1612, tobacco is discovered to be profitable, and the colony begins to experience a dramatic rise in its fortunes. So they're really trying to increase their profits and make it a place to live and not just a place to come and get their gold and go home. All right. So how does the Virginia colony survive? So there's a couple of different ways. One of them is indentured servants. So basically, if you were in England and you wanted to go over to the New World, and initially, like I said, it's just Jamestown. It's the first one. But if you want to go over and you don't have enough money for passage, what you do is sell your services. So you sell your services generally about 7 years was the kind of going rate. Get you over here to the New World, get you passage, get you fed and whatnot while you're initially here. And eventually you'll get a land grant was the promise. So this is the first source of labor in the early English colonies. So even though slavery... African slavery has already begun down in South America, in Brazil with the sugar colonies. It hasn't started. It doesn't start right away in the in North America and in the English colonies. You have John Rolfe. He's growing some tobacco and he's making his name there. And he's the guy who marries Pocahontas. And this is Chief Powhatan's daughter. So John Rolfe, not John Smith, marries Pocahontas. There is a relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas, but it's not a romantic relationship. It's more of a friendly relationship. In 1619, you have a Dutch ship that brings 20 African slaves to the New World. And they're instantly seen as a better source of labor than the indentured servants, who worked for, like I said, about 7 years and then got their freedom. And so... that is where you get the first kind of experience of African slaves in the New World as far as North American English colonies go. All right. So also in Virginia, we have Governor William Berkeley. He was the governor of Virginia. Nobody really liked him. He used his authority to help the rich at the expense of the poor. After a battle between natives and colonists in which Bacon's overseer was killed, Berkeley ruled that no more land would open to settlement. So this is where we get Nathaniel Bacon and Bacon's Rebellion. So you have this battle that went on between the natives and the colonists, and you have this guy, Nathaniel Bacon. His overseer, which is the guy in charge of his plantation, is killed. And so Bacon gets upset. So he leads a group of vigilantes against the Indians. because that's who he sees as the perpetuator of causing the problem. So he orders Berkeley arrested and burned at Jamestown. Bacon does die of an illness soon after, and Berkeley then regains control of the colony. So he dies of illness before he can kind of follow through with killing Berkeley. Because although the natives were the one that killed his overseer, he does see it as Berkeley's fault that it even occurred in the first place. All right, so this is news of the rebellion. So you have strange news from Virginia, being a full and true account of the life and death of Nathaniel Bacon, Esquire. And if you see that little funny little F right here, that is an S. That's just how it used to be written, but it's pronounced like an S. Who is the only cause and original of all the late troubles in that country, with a full relation of all the accidents which have happened in the late war there between the chieftains and Indians. Printed for William Harris next door to the True Style without Moorgate, 1677. This is London. So this is printed in London, which provides details about Bacon's rebellion. Okay. All right. Move on to Maryland. In Maryland, we have Lord Baltimore. So Lord Baltimore founds Maryland in 1634. It is the first colony owned by an individual person, not a joint stock company. And he created it as a safe haven for Catholics. So remember, much of the reason that people came to the New World was for religious freedom. Catholics definitely not being treated well in England at this time. Okay, so this is a map of Maryland. You can see where it's located right above Virginia, on the Potomac River. So right here. And Jamestown is down here on the James River. So it's a little bit of a distance away, especially in the 1600s. Okay. So what are some differences between New England and Chesapeake colonies? So New England colonies are mostly founded by settlers who pay their own way to establish themselves in the New World. Not many of them were indentured servants. The soil in New England is not super conducive for cultivation. Neither was the growing season. It was not very long. So most of the early settlers did so for purely religious reasons. They wished to worship how and what they pleased, and usually settled with like-minded individuals. One of these being the Plymouth colony. It was settled by the Pilgrims, which were the most radical sect of Puritans. They believed that the Church of England still retained too many Catholic institutions, and they needed to be purified. So they're going a step further than the Church of England. Eventually, they crossed the Atlantic to escape persecution in 1620. On this voyage, they craft the Mayflower Compact to govern their lives and their settlement. They do arrive in the middle of winter, and by spring, they are reduced to half their number. So they could have probably planned better on their arrival. They call this the starving time, because they got there, and obviously if you're traveling on a ship, you're not bringing enough food for the next year. You're bringing what you need for the ship ride in assumption that there will be food available once you get to where you're going. So let's see. What else do we have? All right, so you can see your early New England settlements. So you have Maine up here, you have New Hampshire, you have Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven. So if it was unclear, your Chesapeake colonies are going to be Virginia, Maryland, plantation areas, areas where there's good growing and stuff like that. And your New England colonies are going to be the more northern colonies that are going up. All right. The Massachusetts Bay colony comes next. So the Puritans believe that the Church of England needs to be purified of any Catholic remnants left over from the Reformation. So they still think there's too much Catholicism in the Church of England. So in 1629, Charles I grants a charter to the Massachusetts Bay Company to allow Puritans, who are led by John Winthrop, to settle in the New World. He's using a technicality. So Winthrop headquarters the company in the colony itself, which was just a revolutionary idea at the time. Most of the time, these companies were headquartered in England, sometimes even in Asia. But not usually in the colonies. All right, this is John Winthrop. He is the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In his vision, so if you've ever heard City Upon a Hill, this is what he's talking about, and this is who said it, John Winthrop. All right, so we're moving on to Rhode Island. So how does Rhode Island come about? So Massachusetts Bay Colony, they have a very strict adherence to their Puritan beliefs. They don't really leave any room for anybody who disagrees with them. So they're leaving religious persecution to religiously persecute others. As a result, the colonies of disgruntled former residents would emerge. So Rhode Island is one of the settlements that comes out of this. So Roger Williams, he does not get along with John Winthrop. Winthrop cherished his authority over the land and the people as granted him by the King's Royal Charter. So Williams believed in the liberty of man and his ability to commune with God directly. Obviously, this does not go over well with Winthrop, so he banishes Williams from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Williams established his own colony at the mouth of the Narragansett Bay, south of Massachusetts, and it soon becomes known to all as allowing freedom of worship. One of its most famous residents, Rhode Island, was Anne Hutchinson, who, although a woman, she taught that God saved individuals through a covenant of grace, in which a person obtains salvation through the grace of God, not through doing good deeds, known as covenant of works. She was banished from Massachusetts Bay and took up residence in Rhode Island. So many of these colonies did come out of desire for religious freedom, but oddly enough, some of them didn't allow for religious freedom. Right, this is the trial of Anne Hutchinson. So this is a 19th century wood engraving. This is where she stands her ground against the charges of heresy from the leaders of the Puritan Boston. So she does not make a good Puritan woman. So they get rid of her. Okay, so we move on to Connecticut. So this is the expansion of New England. So the colony of Connecticut is originally created as an overflow colony of Massachusetts Bay. It's led by Thomas Hooker, and in 1639 the citizens of the colony established their government through the fundamental orders of Commonwealth. So each of these colonies, a lot of them have their own way of governing, even though they're all kind of subjects of England or colonies of England. All right, moving right along, we have New Hampshire and Maine. So 1633, Connecticut is founded. Its legislature drafted a ruling document entitled The Fundamental Orders, which I just told you about. 1622, you have Sir Ferdinando Gorges and Captain John Mason. They were granted land that is today called Maine and New Hampshire. Due to an overlap of boundaries between Maine and Massachusetts, though, eventually all of Maine would be given to Massachusetts. So, I mean, that's obviously not the way it is today. Maine's a separate place, but this is how things start. All right. So, again, the colonies are very far away from England, and to communicate back and forth, it does take a boat ride, because this is way before telegraphs and all that kind of stuff. So they're kind of left on their own. And England is fighting war. So you have Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven who form an alliance to protect themselves from Native Americans. Also from the French and Canada and the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which does become New York. Virginia and Maryland, they both try to remain loyal to the crown during this time. Virginia protests the execution of Charles I and would only yield to the Commonwealth when commissioners from England granted it the power to elect their own council and governor. Maryland enacts the Toleration Act in 1649. This protects the Puritans there so that their right to worship would not be infringed on. So again, Maryland is started as a Catholic colony, but you have a lot of people who come for the religious freedom, Puritans for one. The same commissioners would revoke the Toleration Act and remove Lord Baltimore from office. Eventually, Cromwell would restore both Baltimore and the Acts. Remember, Oliver Cromwell is in charge of England for some time. With Charles II's restoration, the colonies would seek to obtain royal charters. So now they want to be part of New England at that point. All right, so now we're moving southward here to the Carolinas. So we have North and South Carolina. So Charles II is going to grant the area that is now North and South Carolina to a group of 8 Lord Proprietors who had exclusive ownership. North Carolina is initially settled by settlers of Virginia who had drifted south, and the colony was named Albemarle, and it was settled in the 1650s. It gets a governor in 1664 and an assembly or legislature of some sort in 1665. South Carolina becomes the focus of the Lord Proprietors who established the colony of Charlestown, which is Charleston today. So these are your colonies of North and South Carolina. You can also see Georgia right below there, and then where Spanish Florida is. All right. So when we move into the Carolinas, it's a very predominantly agricultural economy. So you have the Lord Proprietors who are going to promote trade with the Indians in the region. So this is going to increase the Indians' chance of exposure to deadly diseases, while at the same time intertwining them into the economic pattern of the colonist. It's starting to make them dependent on British trade goods like guns and rum. So the Native Americans had lived many, many years without these things, but once they kind of get a taste of it, literally a taste of the rum, but the usage of guns and how much easier it makes their lives as far as hunting and stuff goes, it's hard for them to live without that. So they start to become dependent on these trade goods. You have the Tuscarora and the Yamasee Wars, which are both directly related to the Indian slave trade that had grown up during the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century. At the end of these wars, the Native American population in the area had dwindled significantly. Let's see. This is another drawing by John White. You have Algonquin men in North Carolina broiling fish, which is obviously a dietary staple of coastal societies. Okay. So New Netherland, it becomes New York, so it gives you an idea of where that's located. This is a Dutch colony. It was older than the settlements of New England, but the Dutch were slowly losing their grip on their empire. King James II, he realizes that the Dutch were too weak to stop a takeover, so he orders New Netherland to be captured, and he adds it to his colonies. So if you're wondering how it became part of the 13 colonies when it was not originally English, this is how. You get your first settlers of Jewish descent in 1654. They were pretty much thrown out of New York, which, if you know much about New York today, is kind of amusing. They have a lot of Jewish people in New York. They're forced to be accepted when the Dutch West India Company orders them to be allowed to stay. Although they are allowed to remain, they are not granted the same rights as other citizens, and that does continue on for a very long time. Okay, so this is a 17th century Jewish cemetery in New York City. And if you can see, there are cars there, so this picture is a photograph. It is not from the 17th century. This is just the remnants of it. Okay, so moving on to New Jersey. New Jersey is going to be formed in 1702 when parts of New York are separated and made into a separate royal colony. You know, Pennsylvania, formed by William Penn and his Quaker followers. So unlike Winthrop, Penn encourages members of all denominations to move to his colony. Delaware is also given to Penn to create another colony. So in 1704, it would choose its own assembly, but it shares the same governor. Georgia is created as a buffer state between the colonies and the lawless lands of Spanish-controlled Florida, and it's led by James Oglethorpe. In 1754, control of Georgia reverts back to the crown. So we're getting closer to 1776 here. This is the middle colonies right here. You have New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. Those are your middle colonies. To talk just about the Quakers, this is a picture of a Quaker meeting. You can see that there are women and they are interspersed with men, so they definitely have a different view of women's role in gender equality that the Puritans did not have. Puritan church women sat separate from men and had no say in anything. So remember Anne Hutchinson being kicked out for speaking up. This is going to be your European settlements and Indian societies in early North America. And this is very small, so it is kind of hard to see, but you can see in green are all your Indian settlements up in your Great Lakes area and your up Eastern Woodland, and these are going to be your Mississippi Valley Indians right there, your Mississippi Indians. Okay. So, relationships in New England. So, as the settlers are mostly Christian, they view it their duty to convert the land and its people to Christianity. They don't really find an ethical dilemma in taking the land from its original inhabitants, though, which is interesting. So they think they should all be Christian, but they don't really have a problem with stealing, which is essentially what they're doing. In many of these areas, as the Anglo settlers moved in, the natives are forced out. Some of them did fight back, but a lot of them died of diseases unknown to them before the settlers' arrival. So it's a little easier to take over than it might have been. Initially, the natives do help the English settlers on the coast, but once the settlements begin to flourish, they find themselves unable to stop the encroachment on their land. So initially, they have a really good relationship, but then as these settlements are growing, they're having a hard time kind of holding on. 1636, you have Pequot, who's accused of murdering a colonist in Massachusetts. For revenge, the colonists set fire to Pequot village and kill its inhabitants. The Pequots in turn fight back, and by 1638, the few serving Pequots had signed the Treaty of Hartford, and the Pequot Nation ceased to exist. So again, the killing off of a group of people for a ridiculous reason. 1674, you have King Philip's War. King Philip is, I forget his Indian name, but he's an Indian. He's the leader of the Wampanoags. He resents the colonists' attempts to convert Native Americans to Christianity, and so he prepares for war. A spy warns the colonist, but when that spy is found murdered, the colonists respond by executing 3 Wampanoags. Philip then begins to attack the settlements. Eventually, the colonists win, and the Native Americans in New England cease to be a threat. So, a couple of ways that they got rid of Native Americans. This is an Algonquin ceremony celebrating harvest. As with most Indians, those Algonquins depend on nature for survival, and it shapes their religious beliefs. Remember, multi-gods, nature, animism. Okay, this is an ad for indentured servants from the Virginia Gazette. And this is October 4th, 1779. The people whose services are being offered are secured life in America, but at a steep price. So servants endured years of labor before their contracts expired, and they were granted their freedom. So opportunities to get over here, but not always the good way. Let's see. So slavery in North America. So by 1700, enslaved Africans make up about 11% of the total population in the American colonies. Slaves are starting to become much more common in the Chesapeake colonies in the Carolinas, and this has to do with plantations. The slaves that come to the Americas were mostly war prisoners of a different tribe, sold off for money by the victors of a battle. Slavery in Africa was a little less brutal than it becomes in the Americas. 1 in 6 captives died on the Middle Passage. If you have never seen pictures of that or illustrations or anything like that, it's definitely worth a look. I mean, it's pretty sad how they transported these people over here. So not only are they enslaved, but they are being piled into boats and sitting on top of each other. Obviously not being allowed freedom of movement or anything like that. Many of them got really sick, and they're all kind of in this one hold. So sickness passed easily. Not everybody was seaworthy, meaning, they got seasick and whatnot. So it was a very dangerous trip. Africans from many cultures forged a new identity as African Americans. So there does become a slave culture. And that happens in South America as well. And again, if you ever have any time to do any kind of research or anything, there are several religions down there that kind of come out of those African beliefs, like the African diaspora. Charismatic Catholicism has got African roots as well. So ways that they combined their beliefs in with what they were being told to believe. Okay, so this is kind of how Africans are captured and enslaved. So you can see that it's all along the coast. The slaves that were coming from the middle of the country, the middle of the continent, they're being marched to the coast. And they are coming all over the Americas, Brazil and Guyana, the West Indies, the Caribbean here, and then, of course, the English colonies. This is a slave ship, and this is like a drawing of how the slaves would be, how close they are. So you can see this is the bow of the ship, and how they're all kind of just stuffed in there. This is a diagram from 1808. So it's pretty tragic. Survival of African culture among enslaved Americans is evident in this 18th century painting of a South Carolina plantation. You have a musical instruments and pottery are of African origin, possibly Yoruban. Or Yoruban? Not sure how to pronounce that. Okay, so we're going to end with the colonies here. So, first off, they start with privatization. So by utilizing private investment, England is able to more readily promote settlements in the New World over their counterparts in France and Spain, who retained control by the crown. So because they were allowing people to go and take colonies as individuals or as joint stock companies, they were able to thrive, and that is why the colonies, the English colonies, are way more successful settlements than any of the other countries' colonies. So that is the end of that. So that is our kind of overview of the 13 colonies, how they get there, and kind of how they proceed. So I look forward to talking to you about Chapter 3 next week. Have a great day.